History remembers the weddings of the British aristocracy for their opulence, the sheer volume of imported silk, and the calculated merging of powerful bloodlines. But in the autumn of 1888, the union of the Duke of Somerset and the heiress of the Abernethy fortune was remembered for something else entirely: a suffocating, terrifying silence. When the most powerful peer in England lifted the veil of his unseen bride, he did not smile. He did not recite his vows. The color drained from his face, his lips parted, and the groom, a man known for his booming, authoritative baritone in the House of Lords, was struck entirely mute. He had just made a blind bargain, and standing before him was a ghost. Nathaniel Fitzroy, the 9th Duke of Somerset, was a man cornered by the legacy of his blood. To the outside world, the Fitzroy name was synonymous with vast estates, centuries of unblemished prestige, and the sprawling magnificence of the Chatsworth-adjacent Somerset Manor. In reality, the estate was bleeding to death. Nathaniel's late father had heavily leveraged their fortunes on disastrous speculative ventures with the East India Company and deep debts owed to the Rothschild banking syndicate. The Duke had inherited a crown of thorns and a ledger dripping in red ink. At 32, Nathaniel was pragmatic, hardened by grief, and completely devoid of romantic sentiment. He had loved once, fiercely and entirely, during a rebellious youth in Paris. Her name was Josephine, a brilliant, penniless artist with a laugh that could shame the sun. But Josephine had perished in a horrific carriage fire 5 years prior near the Pont Neuf, a tragedy that had burned the capacity for love entirely out of Nathaniel's chest. Since that day he had returned to London, taken up his title, and turned his heart to iron. So, when Lord Richard Abernethy, a ruthless industrialist who had built an empire on steel and northern railways, approached Nathaniel with a proposition, the Duke treated it purely as a business transaction. Abernethy craved the one thing his millions could not buy: aristocratic legitimacy. He offered the hand of his only daughter, Catherine Abernethy, along with a dowry so astronomical it would instantly wipe clean the Fitzroy debts and secure the dukedom for another century. The conditions were remarkably unorthodox. Abernethy insisted the courtship be entirely on paper. "My daughter is of delicate constitution, Your Grace," the industrial baron had stated, swirling brandy in his crystal glass within the smoky confines of the Diogenes Club. "She was raised privately in Switzerland after a severe childhood illness. She requires no grand balls, no tedious societal parades. You will meet her at the altar of St. George's, Hanover Square. You sign the contracts, I transfer the funds, and you both do your duty." Nathaniel agreed. He did not care if Catherine Abernethy was plain, pockmarked, or possessed the personality of a damp rag. She was a solvent to his financial ruin. He signed the marriage settlement without hesitation. The wedding day arrived in late November, blanketed by a thick, suffocating London fog that tasted of coal and damp earth. St. George's was packed with the highest echelons of society, the pews a sea of whispering aristocrats, eager to see the industrialist's daughter who had bought her way into a dukedom. Nathaniel stood at the altar, immaculately dressed, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. Then, the massive oak doors groaned open. Catherine Abernethy walked down the aisle on her father's arm. She was completely obscured by a heavy, antique lace veil that fell to her waist. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as if she were a doll being marched to a display case. She reached the altar. Lord Abernethy placed her cold, gloved hand into Nathaniel's. "The Archbishop of Canterbury," began the solemn liturgy. When the moment arrived for the groom to look upon his bride and speak his vows, Nathaniel reached out and gently lifted the heavy lace. The air in Nathaniel's lungs vanished. The face looking back at him was not a stranger's. It was the face he had mourned for 5 agonizing years. The delicate slope of her jaw, the piercing, storm-gray eyes, the slight, almost imperceptible asymmetry of her lower lip. It was Josephine. She was older, her skin paler, and the warmth that used to radiate from her eyes was entirely absent, replaced by a vacant, chilling obedience. But it was her. The woman he had watched burn in a Parisian carriage. Panic, absolute and primal, seized the Duke, his mind fractured under the weight of the impossibility. "She is dead. I buried her. Who is this? Your Grace?" the Archbishop prompted, leaning forward. "The vows." Nathaniel opened his mouth. He commanded his vocal cords to move, to scream, to demand an explanation, to say her name. But nothing happened. A severe psychological block, a trauma-induced paralysis, clamped down on his throat like an iron vice. He gasped. A harsh, ragged exhalation of air, but no sound followed. The silence stretched. The whispers in the pews ignited into a frantic buzzing. Lord Abernathy's face darkened with fury. Nathaniel stared at the woman. Catherine? Josephine? His chest heaving. She stared back, her expression perfectly blank, showing not a flicker of recognition. With a trembling hand, realizing his voice was utterly, terrifyingly gone, Nathaniel gave a sharp, definitive nod to the Archbishop. He took the ring, shoved it onto her finger, and signed the registry in a violent scrawl. He had married a ghost, and the shock had stolen his voice. The scandal of the silent Duke consumed London overnight. The society papers speculated wildly. Had the Duke suffered an apoplexy? Was it a curse brought on by his father's sins in India? Or was the bride so hideously disfigured that the shock had paralyzed him? Behind the heavy, gilded doors of Somerset Manor, the reality was far more claustrophobic. Nathaniel was subjected to grueling examinations by the finest medical minds in Europe. Dr. Thomas Arras, Nathaniel's oldest confidant and a pioneer in the emerging field of neurology, was summoned immediately. Dr. Arras consulted the texts of Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot, the famous Parisian neurologist. Diagnosing Nathaniel with psychogenic aphonia, a severe hysterical paralysis of the vocal cords brought on by profound shock. There was no physical damage. His mind had simply refused to let him speak. But Nathaniel could not write the truth to Dr. Arras. He could not write, "My new wife is my dead lover." It sounded like madness. If he revealed this, they would lock him in an asylum, and Abernathy would seize the Fitzroy estate entirely. He had to unravel the mystery himself, trapped in a prison of his own silence. The new Duchess of Somerset, Catherine, was an enigma wrapped in ice. She occupied the grand suite opposite his, moving through the manor like an exquisite, silent apparition. She spoke very little, and when she did, her voice lacked the fiery, melodic cadence of the Josephine he knew. It was flat, measured, and stripped of emotion. On their fourth evening in the manor, Nathaniel requested her presence in his private study. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the mahogany shelves. Catherine entered, wearing a high-collared gown of dark, emerald silk, her posture impossibly rigid. Nathaniel sat at his desk. He pushed a piece of heavy parchment across the polished wood. On it, he had written in bold, desperate strokes, "Who are you?" Catherine looked at the paper, then up at him, her storm-gray eyes unblinking. "I am Catherine Fitzroy, Duchess of Somerset, your wife, your Grace." Nathaniel shook his head violently. He scribbled again, his quill snapping from the force. "Before that, before Abernathy, Paris, 1883, Josephine." A faint, almost imperceptible furrow appeared on her brow. She stared at the name Josephine. For a singular heartbeat, a flicker of confusion, perhaps pain, crossed her eyes. But it was quickly, violently suppressed, replaced by a terrifying blankness. "I do not know that name," she said softly. "My father brought me from Switzerland. I suffered a terrible fever in my youth. It burned away my early memories. I only know who I am now. And I am yours to command, as my father instructed." The sheer subservience in her tone made Nathaniel physically sick. Josephine had been a tempest. She would have thrown the inkwell at his head for suggesting she was anyone's to command. He studied her intensely. If this was a doppelganger, it was a cruel joke of genetics, but he needed absolute proof. He remembered a detail. During their bohemian days in Montmartre, Josephine had fallen from a stone wall while trying to steal an apple from a neighbor's orchard. She had sustained a deep, jagged gash just below her left collarbone, which healed into a very distinct, crescent-shaped scar. Nathaniel stood up. He walked slowly around the desk, his imposing figure towering over her. Catherine did not flinch, but her breathing hitched. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently laid his fingers against the high lace collar of her gown. She stiffened, her eyes widening in a sudden spike of genuine fear. "Your grace, please." But Nathaniel was driven by a desperate, agonizing need. With a swift, precise movement, he undid the top 2 pearl buttons of her collar and brushed the fabric aside. There, resting perfectly against her pale skin, just below the clavicle, was a jagged, crescent-shaped scar. Nathaniel stumbled back, hitting the edge of the desk. The room spun. It was her. She was alive. But her mind had been wiped clean, overwritten by a ruthless industrialist. The carriage crash hadn't killed her. It had broken her. And Richard Abernathy had somehow stolen the pieces. The revelation shifted Nathaniel's terror into a cold, calculated fury. His voice was gone, but his mind was sharper than ever. He was no longer just a husband dealing with an arranged marriage. He was a man infiltrating an enemy's plot within his own home. He began to play a dangerous game. To Lord Abernathy, who visited the manor with alarming frequency, Nathaniel played the role of the humiliated, broken aristocrat. He allowed Abernathy to strut through the halls, admiring the ancestral portraits as if he already owned them. Abernathy clearly reveled in the Duke's mute condition, viewing it as a sign of weakness, an unexpected bonus in his conquest of the Fitzroy legacy. "Such a pity about your affliction, Somerset," Abernathy sneered one evening in the drawing room, swirling his brandy. Catherine sat nearby, stitching embroidery with robotic precision. "But actions speak louder than words, do they not?" "Catherine knows her duty. She will provide you an heir, and the estate will prosper under my guidance." Nathaniel stared at the older man, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He didn't write a response. He simply held Abernathy's gaze with a look of such concentrated menace that the industrialist eventually looked away, clearing his throat uncomfortably. When Abernathy left, Nathaniel turned his attention to his wife. If he was going to save her from whatever psychological prison her father had built, he had to reach the woman buried inside. He could not speak to her, so he had to find another language. He started with music. In Paris, Josephine had played the piano with a wild, undisciplined passion. Catherine never touched the grand piano in the music room. One rainy afternoon, Nathaniel led her into the room, gently sat her on the bench, and sat beside her. He took her hands. They were cold, trembling slightly, and placed them on the keys. He began to play the bass notes of a piece she used to love. A frantic, obscure waltz by a Parisian street composer. He played his part, leaving the melody empty, waiting for her. Catherine sat motionless for a long time. Then, almost involuntarily, her right index finger twitched. She pressed a key, then another. Haltingly, clumsily, her hands began to find the melody. Her breathing quickened. The flat, vacant look in her eyes fractured, replaced by a look of sheer, terrifying confusion. She played a few bars perfectly, the muscle memory bypassing the amnesia. Suddenly, she slammed her hands down in a discordant crash and pulled away, gasping for air, as if she were drowning. "Stop! I don't know this!" My father said I am not to play. Nathaniel reached out, grabbing her arms gently but firmly, turning her to face him. He looked deep into her panicked eyes, silently pleading with her to fight the programming, to remember the fire they once shared. Meanwhile, he tasked Dr. Eris with a covert mission, Communicating through tightly sealed, ciphered notes, Nathaniel sent Eris to Paris. He needed to know exactly what happened the night of the carriage fire 5 years ago. He needed hospital records from the Hôtel Dieu, police reports from the Sûreté, and anything connected to a British industrialist lingering around the tragedy. 2 weeks later, Eris returned under the cover of darkness, slipping through the servant's entrance to Nathaniel's study. The doctor looked utterly haggard, dropping a leather satchel onto the desk. "You are not mad, Nathaniel," Eris whispered, his voice shaking. "But you are in grave danger." Nathaniel rapidly wrote on his slate. "What did you find?" "The carriage crash that killed Josephine was not an accident," Eris explained, pulling out a stack of burnt police files. "The axle was deliberately sawed. She survived, but suffered severe head trauma and was taken to a charity ward. A week later, she was transferred out under the authorization of a wealthy English benefactor who claimed her as his estranged ward." Eris pointed to a signature on a faded transfer document. It read, "Richard Abernathy." Nathaniel's blood ran entirely cold. "But why?" Eris asked, pacing the room. "Why would a man like Abernathy attempt to murder a Parisian artist only to save her, wipe her past, and mold her into his daughter?" Nathaniel stared at the flames in the hearth. He knew why. Josephine wasn't just an artist. She was the illegitimate daughter of a disgraced French aristocrat who had, before his ruin, discovered a massive, undocumented vein of coal and iron beneath a swath of disputed land in the north of England, land that bordered the Abernathy Empire. Josephine possessed the original deeds, sewn into the lining of her sketchbook. Abernathy hadn't just bought a dukedom, he had kidnapped the only person who could contest his most lucrative territories, brainwashed her, and was now using her to completely legitimize his stolen empire. The Duke of Somerset looked down at his trembling hands. His wife was not just a ghost. She was the key to a devastating conspiracy. And the man who held the strings was sleeping under his roof tonight. Nathaniel realized then that finding his voice wouldn't be enough. He was going to have to go to war. To wage a war without a voice required a terrifying level of discipline. Nathaniel Fitzroy, Duke of Somerset, transformed his ancestral home into a silent battlefield. To the servants and the ever-watchful society gossips, the Duke was a tragic figure, a man broken by the shock of his own wedding. But behind the locked doors of his study, Nathaniel was orchestrating the absolute destruction of Lord Richard Abernathy. His first move was to sever Abernathy's chemical hold over his wife. Nathaniel had observed a chilling routine. Every evening before retiring, Catherine's personal maid, a severe, hawkish woman named Mrs. Danvers, handpicked by Abernathy, administered a tonic to the Duchess. Abernathy claimed it was a Swiss homeopathic remedy to prevent the return of her childhood fever. Nathaniel, drawing on his own grim knowledge of Victorian apothecaries, recognized the dull, glassy sheen it left in Catherine's eyes. It was a tincture of bromide and heavy laudanum, designed to suppress nervous energy and, crucially, to keep her mind pliant and her memories deeply submerged in a narcotic fog. One evening, while Mrs. Danvers was occupied in the laundry quarters, Nathaniel slipped into Catherine's dressing room. He found the dark glass bottle of the tonic. With meticulous care, he emptied the opiate into the wash basin and refilled the bottle with distilled water and a few drops of bitter chicory to mimic the taste. The withdrawal was a harrowing ordeal, one Nathaniel had to watch in agonizing silence. By the third day, without the narcotic, the dutiful, robotic Catherine began to fracture. She suffered terrible migraines. She paced the grand corridors of Somerset Manor at all hours, her hands trembling. And then, the night terrors began. Nathaniel would stand outside her bedroom door, his heart shattering as he heard her scream in the dead of night. Not in English, but in rapid, terrified French. "Au feu! Aidez! Moi! Le fiacre brûle! Fire! Help me! The carriage is burning!" He could not verbally comfort her, nor could he risk holding her, fearing that physical restraint might trigger a deeper trauma. Instead, he would enter her room, light a single candle, and sit quietly in the corner chair until her breathing slowed. Catherine would wake, drenched in a cold sweat, staring at him with eyes that were slowly losing their dull obedience and replacing it with a piercing, desperate confusion. She was waking up, and the process was violent. While Catherine's mind fought to rebuild itself, Nathaniel enlisted the most formidable legal weapon in London, Sir George Henry Lewis. Sir George was a real and terrifying force in Victorian society. A solicitor operating out of Ely Place, Lewis was the man the aristocracy turned to when they needed scandals buried or enemies utterly ruined. He was known to keep a locked filing cabinet containing the darkest secrets of the British Empire, and he possessed an intelligence network that rivaled Scotland Yard. Nathaniel summoned Sir George to the Diogenes Club under the guise of finalizing some estate taxes. In the private, wood-paneled reading room, Nathaniel slid a heavy leather journal across the table to the legendary solicitor. Inside, written in Nathaniel's sharp, urgent script, was the entire, unbelievable truth. The carriage fire in Paris, the stolen identity, the hidden coal deeds, and Abernathy's monumental fraud. Sir George Lewis, a man who had seen blackmail, murder, and treason, read the pages without a single change in his expression. When he finished, he closed the journal and looked at the mute Duke. "If this is the delusion of a grieving mind, Your Grace, you belong in Bedlam," Sir George murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "If it is the truth, Richard Abernathy has committed a crime so audacious it will hang him at Newgate. You require proof. Ironclad, irrefutable proof." Nathaniel nodded once, firmly. He wrote on his slate, "Goron, Paris." A rare smile touched Sir George's lips. "Inspector Marie-François Goron of the Sûreté." "Yes. A brilliant detective, and a personal acquaintance of mine. I will telegraph him tonight. We need the original hospital records from the Hôtel Dieu that Abernathy tried to destroy, and we need the location of the sketchbook containing those coal deeds. Abernathy is arrogant, but he is not a fool. He will not have destroyed the deeds. They are the sole source of his power over the Northern Territories. The trap was set, but time was rapidly running out. Lord Abernathy, a predator by nature, sensed the shifting atmosphere at Somerset Manor. He visited unannounced on a Tuesday, his heavy boots echoing ominously on the marble floors. He demanded an audience with his daughter. Nathaniel watched from the shadows of the mezzanine as Abernathy cornered Catherine in the conservatory. Without the laudanum, Catherine looked entirely different. The rigid posture was gone, replaced by a defensive, tightly coiled tension. "You look unwell, my dear," Abernathy purred, stepping too close to her, his hand reaching out to grip her chin. "Mrs. Danvers tells me you have been restless. Are you forgetting your duties to your father?" Catherine flinched, slapping his hand away. It was the first act of defiance she had shown since the wedding. Abernathy's eyes widened in genuine shock, followed instantly by a terrifying, cold rage. "What did you do?" Abernathy hissed, grabbing her wrist with bone-crushing force. "Have you been listening to the mute idiot you married? You are nothing without me, Catherine. I built you. I saved you from the gutter. You will take your medicine, and you will sign the joint tenancy agreements tomorrow, or I promise you, the fever will return, and it will be fatal." Nathaniel's vision went entirely red. He gripped the mahogany banister so hard the wood groaned. The psychological block in his throat constricted, a phantom hand choking him. He wanted to roar, to throw the industrialist through the glass windows of the conservatory. But he forced himself to remain still. If he intervened violently now, without the legal proof, Abernathy would simply call the authorities, claim the Duke had gone mad, and take Catherine away permanently. He watched Catherine pull her arm free, her storm-gray eyes blazing with a fire that belonged entirely to Josephine. She didn't know who she was yet, but her soul was remembering how to fight. "Do not touch me," she whispered, her voice shaking but laced with venom. Abernathy smoothed his lapels, his face a mask of furious calculation. "Tomorrow night, Duke," he shouted toward the upper gallery, knowing Nathaniel was listening. "We dine at 8. Have your solicitors present. We are finalizing the estate transfers, or I am taking my daughter back to Switzerland for her health." It was an ultimatum. The final battle lines were drawn. The tempest that battered the ancient stone facades of Somerset Manor that evening felt less like weather and more like a biblical judgment. Sheets of freezing rain lashed against the 20-foot stained glass windows of the grand dining hall, the water distorting the ancestral crests into twisted, weeping shapes. Thunder did not merely roll, it detonated, rattling the fine bone china in the mahogany cupboards and sending vibrations deep into the soles of the boots of every man present. The atmosphere within the room was suffocating, thick with the smell of beeswax, roasted pheasant that no one was eating, and a tension so sharp it could draw blood. Lord Richard Abernathy had orchestrated this dinner as his final coronation. He sat at the head of the table, a deliberate, insulting usurpation of the Duke's chair. Flanking him were his two corporate barristers, Mr. Higgins and Mr. Croft, men with faces like ledger books and eyes completely devoid of warmth. Sir George Henry Lewis sat opposite them. The legendary solicitor looked entirely unbothered by the apocalyptic storm or the hostile company, casually swirling a glass of deep red claret, his spectacles reflecting the dim candlelight. At the center of the long table sat Nathaniel Fitzroy. His face was a masterpiece of aristocratic impassivity, an emotionless mask carved from marble, though beneath the table, his fists were clenched so tightly, his knuckles were bone white. Beside his silver charger plate rested his slate and chalk, the agonizing symbols of his confinement. To Nathaniel's right sat Catherine, or rather, the woman waking up to the realization that she was Josephine. The withdrawal from Abernathy's chemical prison had taken a severe physical toll. Her skin was translucent, her dark hair swept up but revealing the fine, trembling tension in her neck. Yet, the dull, bovine obedience was gone. Her storm-gray eyes were dilated, hyper-aware, darting between the men at the table, absorbing the aggressive posturing. She wore a gown of heavy midnight blue velvet, and her fingers compulsively traced the high collar, just above the hidden crescent scar. "Let us dispense with the tedious aristocratic pleasantries, gentlemen," Abernathy announced, breaking the heavy silence. He pushed his untouched plate of food away with a look of disdain. He snapped his thick, ringed fingers. Instantly, Mr. Higgins slid a massive, leather-bound folio across the polished mahogany table. It stopped inches from Nathaniel's slate. "The Duke's unfortunate affliction," Abernathy began, his voice dripping with false sympathy that thinly veiled his absolute triumph, "has caused unacceptable instability in the markets. The Fitzroy creditors are circling like vultures. The Rothschilds are threatening to call in the remainder of the father's debts by week's end. This document, Your Grace, transfers full executive control of the Somerset estates, the tenant farms, and all attached holdings to my firm. It grants me power of attorney. In exchange, I will personally underwrite and clear the remaining debts entirely." It was a total, humiliating capitulation. It was the legal equivalent of a beheading. If Nathaniel put his signature to that parchment, he would be a duke in name, only a penniless tenant in his own ancestral home, completely at the mercy of the man who had stolen the woman he loved. Abernathy leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the table. "Sign it, Somerset. You are a mute cripple leading a dying house. I am offering you salvation. Take the pen." Nathaniel did not move. He did not look at the document. He simply stared at Abernathy, his dark eyes burning with a cold, concentrated fury that made Mr. Croft shift uncomfortably in his seat. Sir George Lewis slowly set his crystal glass down. The soft clink echoed loudly in the quiet room. He adjusted his spectacles, his expression shifting from mild amusement to something remarkably dangerous. "A truly fascinating proposal, Lord Abernathy," Sir George murmured. His voice was a dry rasp, yet it commanded the room entirely. However, I must advise my client against signing this document. It is, quite frankly, legally unenforceable." Abernathy scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Unenforceable? Do not play games with me, Lewis. I am his father-in-law. I am stepping in to manage the affairs of a mentally incapacitated man. The courts will practically hand it to me. It is unenforceable," Sir George continued, his tone dropping to a silken, lethal whisper, "because the marriage itself is entirely invalid. The woman sitting beside the Duke is not your daughter." The dining room plunged into a vacuum of silence, broken only by a massive, blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark white, followed instantly by a crack of thunder that shook the floorboards. Abernathy's ruddy face blanched, the color draining so fast he looked sickly. But he was a street fighter, masquerading as a gentleman, and he quickly rallied, slamming both fists onto the table. "How dare you!" Abernathy roared, spittle flying from his lips. "What is the meaning of this absolute madness? Somerset, control your solicitor, or I swear to God I will leave this house and let you rot in debtor's prison." Sir George completely ignored the outburst. With agonizing slowness, he reached into the breast pocket of his tailored coat and produced a thick stack of telegraphs wrapped in the official blue ribbon of the French Sûreté. "At precisely 4 o'clock this afternoon, Parisian time," Sir George stated, laying the telegraphs out like playing cards. "Inspector Marie-François Goron, accompanied by a magistrate, raided a private safety deposit box at the Banque de France. The box was registered under a holding company directly linked to you, Lord Abernathy." Abernathy stopped breathing. The two barristers beside him suddenly looked very small, realizing they were sitting next to a detonating bomb. Inside, Sir George continued relentlessly. Inspector Goron found a water-damaged, leather-bound sketchbook. It belonged to a French citizen named Josephine Roux. Bound into the very spine of that book, sewn into the leather itself, were the original, unalterable royal deeds to the subterranean coal veins in the Tyne Valley, the exact veins that currently fuel the entire Abernathy steel empire. Beside Nathaniel, Catherine emitted a shattered, breathless gasp. At the sound of the name Josephine Roux, a visible, violent tremor shook her body. She pressed both hands hard against her temples, her breathing turning shallow and frantic. The heavy velvet of her dress rose and fell rapidly. "Lies!" Abernathy shouted, standing up so violently, his heavy oak chair crashed backward onto the marble floor. "You fabricated this. This is a desperate, aristocratic trick. She is Catherine Abernathy. She has been my daughter for 20 years. You have no proof." Inspector Goron did not stop at the bank, Sir George said, raising his voice to cut through Abernathy's panic. He tossed a secondary stack of translated documents onto the table. They landed with a heavy, damning thud. He also secured the medical transfer papers and the duty logs from the charity ward at the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, dated November 14th, 1883. The records show you bribed a desperate ward nurse to falsify Josephine Roux's death certificate after a carriage crash. A crash, I might add, that the Parisian police have now reclassified as attempted murder, as the carriage's axle was found to be deliberately severed by a saw. Nathaniel watched Abernathy's empire disintegrate in real time. You smuggled an amnesiac, severely traumatized young woman across the Swiss border. Sir George delivered the final, crushing blow. You heavily drugged her with opiates, and you ruthlessly gaslighted her into believing she was your fictitious, sickly daughter. You erased a human being, Lord Abernathy, all to ensure the rightful heir to the Northern Coal Empire could never contest your fraudulent claims. You are not a father. You are a kidnapper, a thief, and a monster. "Stop it! Stop it!" Josephine screamed. She stood up, her own chair tumbling backward. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white. The dam, holding back her shattered mind, was breaking under the immense pressure of the truth. The floodwaters of suppressed memory rushed in, violent and unforgiving. She saw the cobblestones of Montmartre. She smelled the bitter bite of absinthe and oil paints. She felt the heavy, suffocating smoke of the burning carriage. She heard the horrifying splinter of wood, the heat of the flames blistering her skin. And then, piercing through the agony, she saw the face of the man she loved, screaming her name, trying to reach her through the inferno. She turned her head slowly, the agonizing weight of 5 stolen years lifting from her shoulders. She looked down at Nathaniel. The psychological programming shattered like fragile glass. "Nathaniel?" she whispered. The flat, measured English tone was gone. Her voice was thick, raw, and laced heavily with the beautiful melodic French accent that had been buried for half a decade. "Nathaniel, the bridge. We were on the bridge. The carriage." Abernathy realized he was completely trapped. The deeds were found. The sûreté was involved. The barristers beside him were already inching away, mentally calculating their own defense strategies. His empire was gone. Cornered, furious, and facing the hangman's noose at Newgate, the thin veneer of his civilization completely evaporated. He became a cornered animal. If he was going down, he would silence the only living witness. "You belong to me!" Abernathy snarled, his face twisted into a mask of pure, murderous hatred. He lunged across the distance between them with surprising speed for a heavy man. His massive hands reached out, his fingers curling into claws, aiming directly for Josephine's throat, intending to drag her down, to break her neck before the constabulary could arrive. Nathaniel saw the man who had orchestrated the fire, the man who had stolen the light from Josephine's eyes and replaced it with a narcotic fog, laying hands on her once more. The psychological block that had locked Nathaniel's throat for months, the profound hysterical paralysis born of absolute, helpless grief, was met by a force infinitely stronger. It was obliterated by a tidal wave of pure, absolute, violently protective rage. The trauma could not hold him back anymore. The iron vice around his vocal cords shattered. Nathaniel surged upward from his chair. He was a terrifying figure of wrath, the full imposing height and physical power of the Duke of Somerset unleashed. Before Abernathy's hands could even brush the velvet of Josephine's gown, Nathaniel intercepted him. He grabbed the industrialist by the heavy lapels of his immaculate coat. With a raw, guttural exertion of strength, Nathaniel lifted the heavier man off his feet and hurled him backward. Abernathy flew across the room, crashing violently into a massive antique serving sideboard. Silver platters, crystal decanters, and priceless porcelain shattered into 1,000 pieces over the marble floor as Abernathy collapsed among the ruins, groaning in pain. "Get your hands off my wife!" The Duke's voice, silent for what felt like an eternity, erupted into the cavernous room with the percussive force of a cannon shot. It was not a weak, recovering rasp. It was a terrifying, booming baritone that shook the dust from the chandeliers and dominated the thunder raging outside. Mr. Higgins and Mr. Croft cried out, scrambling backward in absolute terror, tripping over their own feet to escape the wrath of the Duke. Sir George Lewis simply smiled, took another calm sip of his claret, and watched justice unfold. Nathaniel stood over the broken industrialist, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched, his voice ringing with absolute, crushing authority. "You are trespassing in my home, you absolute bastard," Nathaniel roared, the sound of his own voice vibrating through his skull. "You thought you could buy my name. You thought you could steal her life and bury her alive in my own house. You are finished. I will see you hang." He did not wait for Abernathy to respond. He turned his back on the ruined man and looked at Josephine. She was standing perfectly still, weeping freely. The tears carved tracks down her pale cheeks, but the vacant, terrified stare of Catherine Abernathy was gone forever. The fierce, beautiful, chaotic soul of the Parisian artist had returned to her eyes, burning brighter than ever. "Josephine," Nathaniel said. His voice dropped the booming authority, cracking into a gravelly, desperate whisper as the reality of the moment crushed him. He fell to his knees on the hard floor before her, looking up at the woman he had mourned for 5 years. "It's me. I'm here. I have you." With a ragged sob, she collapsed to her knees with him. She threw her arms around his neck, pulling him against her with desperate strength. She buried her face in his shoulder, her fingers tangling in his hair, crying his name over and over again. Mon amour, she wept in rapid, beautiful French, the words a balm to his scarred heart. Tu m'as trouvé. You found me. The heavy oak doors of the dining hall burst open moments later, revealing a dozen officers of the local constabulary, summoned well in advance by Sir George Lewis. As they dragged a bleeding, swearing Richard Abernathy out into the pouring rain and the waiting iron cuffs, Nathaniel held Josephine tighter. The ghost was gone. The silence was broken. The Duke had found his voice, and in doing so, he had finally brought his true love home. What an incredible journey of betrayal, lost identities, and a love powerful enough to shatter the deepest silences. The story of Nathaniel and Josephine proves that while the past can be hidden, the truth and true love will always find a way to scream out in the end. History is full of these dark, hidden corners where wealth and power try to rewrite reality, but nothing is stronger than the human spirit fighting for the ones it loves. If this deep dive into the scandalous, secret history of the Silent Duke kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It helps the channel bring you more incredible, real-feeling historical dramas. Share this video with your friends who love a twisted romance, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next descent into the dramatic, forgotten pages of history. See you in the next story.
Hi, my name is Primal Bond Living, the owner and manager of Primal Bond Living. After watching the video, the Duke accepted the arranged marriage unseen. Upon seeing her, he lost his voice. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the sense of surprise and vulnerability woven into the story. Arranged marriages in historical romance often begin with uncertainty, expectations, and assumptions, but sometimes a single moment can change everything. What I enjoyed here was the idea that first impressions can challenge everything we think we know and open the door to a completely different future. Do you think the Duke's reaction was driven more by appearance, destiny, or something deeper he sensed in that moment? And if you were entering a life-changing commitment without truly knowing the other person, what would matter most to you? Stories like this remind me that people are often far more complex and remarkable than the expectations we place on them. If this story stayed with you after the ending, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy historical romance stories filled with emotion, unexpected connections, and memorable characters, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.